So we're here today having a conversation with Janaya, also known as Jay or Future Khan, the co-founder and a very active member in the Toronto chapter of the Black Lives Matter movement. But I just wanted to thank you first and foremost for joining us in this interview here today and welcome you.
Yeah, I'm very grateful to be here and I'm excited about the conversations we're going to have and the change we're going to bring with that.
Was there a moment which acted as a catalyst to which you can attribute your activism to?
For sure. I mean, I've seen a lot of my friends at a young age die from either lateral racism or police brutality. I think a lot of things that I've gone through in my life have prepared me for the moments that I'm engaging in now, whether it's from street involvement or homelessness or growing up in group homes and, having sort of a lot of run-ins with the police. That became increasingly violent in my teenage years, and watching people I knew become gridlocked and seeing what the implications and manifestations of oppression looks like on their bodies without having the language or the analysis to understand. And so while I can cite that in a lot of ways I think my life and my relationships have prepared me for these moments, certainly I became my activism manifested and I became politicized once I really started to box. Actually, boxing has been sort of my intermediary into activism.
As well as being heavily involved in the Black Lives Matter Toronto chapter, you're also the co-founder. Could you tell us a little bit about this?
Yes, co-founding. So when the entire nation state of the United States was sort of impacted by Mike Brown and Darren Wilson, the officer who killed him, who was not indicted. We saw protests here in the UK. In Toronto, we also had a protest around solidarity for Mike Brown and used that as an opportunity to also talk about anti-Black racism in Canada, talk about carding practices that were arbitrarily stopping primarily Black people, where there was a huge sort of outcry for change around that, but the public wasn't really mobilized around it, and certainly that wasn't going to incite change sort of in the higher structures that determine what happens on the ground. So with that, we started talking about Jermaine Carby, who was a 33-year-old Black man who was killed by Peel Police, which is right outside of Toronto. And we used sort of the platform that Black Lives Matter had, the hashtag had really allocated to talk about Mike Brown, to also talk about what's happening there. And I had a really spectacular team. We put some things in motion, but realistically, we weren't sure if Darren Wilson was going to be indicted or not. I think every Black person in the world knew on some level that it wasn't going to happen. And so we were prepared for it. And the majority of that protest happened in the last 24 hours. And we had around 3,000 people come out in the freezing cold. And we saw that there was a need for change in Toronto. We know that we needed a place for our grief and our rage and our activism that sort of centralized the Black experience. In a plural way, because in Canada we have a huge manifestation of different forms of Blackness, where people are Somali, Eritrean, Ethiopian, Haitian, Congolese, Trinidadian, Jamaican, Guyanese, and so many more. And how could a Black Lives Matter movement be transformative in a place like that? In a place like Canada, where there's this myth of the racial haven, where there's no data a lot of the time that to refute and to infuse our sort of politics, and we have really recognized the need for that. And so we're campaigning in a lot of ways. We're sort of setting the precedent around what Black liberation could look like, and we're shaping the narrative of anti-Black racism in Canada. But our goal is to be a platform more than to be the movement, because we believe that communities all over Canada that look at sort of Black liberation need to be able to self-determine in ways that translate for those communities.
Could you tell us a bit about the Justice for Jermaine mobilisation in response to the killing of Jermaine and how it was organised?
There's always stirrings of movements in Toronto, and some of them sort of manifest and take and some of them don't. Black Lives Matter took in a very profound way, and while the work of Justice for Jermaine was incredibly important, I don't know that people were really garnering around it in the way that they should, and that is because I think Canada is in denial around its anti-Black racism and its colonial past and history. And so to only speak and exclusively and organize exclusively around a Canadian-based issue like the murder of Jermaine Carby wasn't going to bring out so many people. And so we partnered with them. The folks who run that, one of them, the lead in that is Latanya Grant, who is Jermaine Carby's cousin. And so at our very first protest, we had her come out and speak and talk about it so that we could really challenge the crowd and the narrative and bring a humanity to Jermaine Carby that had been robbed by the media, where they really demonized him and talked about past charges as if that had anything to do with the fact that he was killed by Peel police minutes after leaving his home when they had no idea who he was. And so there's a lot of inconsistencies in what they were saying, and we've sort of renewed our organizing around Justice for Jermaine because we had to wait while the Special Investigations Unit, which is our sort of supposed to be a board of civilians who sort of monitor and keep the police accountable, except they're all former police officers. And so they investigate incidents that occur that typically result in death between police and civilian interactions, or where violence is sort of cited. And of course the police officer was not charged, even though a knife appeared around the scene hours after everything had been cleaned up and removed, and hours after they had collected sort of all evidence. So there's a lot of inconsistencies there. They have said that, that someone had sort of tampered with the evidence, and that's a problem. And so how can we have these inconsistencies and no charges have been laid? So Justice for Jermaine was all about bringing attention to those inconsistencies, challenging the fact that the SIU and its practice is inherently problematic, challenging the fact that the portrayal of Jermaine Carby in the media, challenging anti-Black racism there. We also linked it to another campaign that was happening, which was around Andrew Loku, who is a Sudanese man in his 40s with some mental health sort of expressions that placed them into housing for folks who needed assistance around mental health expressions. And the police came into his apartment, and within seconds, he had a hammer in his hand and he was a certain distance away from them. And the reason why he had the hammer was because people were making noise upstairs, which is why the complaint was made in the first place. And he was sort of banging on the wall to also, get the neighbors upset and be like, see, I can hear you. And so even at that distance, they deemed him a threat and shot him within seconds of seeing him in the head. And it's important that we note that Andrew Loku came here to escape what was war in the time around Sudan and South Sudan. And so he came to Canada to escape war, to be killed by the police within seconds of seeing him. And he was supporting his family. And so these are things that are happening in Canada that no one's really talking about. And having a campaign like Justice for Jermaine, I think, is incredibly important, especially when it's family run, because it's a self-determined, autonomous campaign. But that's what I mean when I say Black Lives Matter should be a platform, because of its popularity and because of the way in which it's sort of shaped the narrative of anti-Black racism all over the world. With the advent of social media particularly, we have an opportunity to sort of link globally what our movements could look like, but it also requires us to give space to families to grieve and to fight for justice in their own self-determined way.
One very noticeable difference in the Black Lives Matter movement from liberation movements of the past is that it's a movement led by women, and as a result, a movement that centres the voices of the most marginalised, like trans women of colour. Following this, what tips do you have for Black activists, Black student activists in the UK, and Black activists in general, for keeping our movements intersectional and centering the experiences of those generally considered to be on the margins?
I think it's incredibly important that we agitate around the militarization of the police, around police brutality and its practice. But oftentimes our movements are becoming singularized around championing a particular campaign, a very specific one, like carding, for example, which we did in Canada, or stop and frisk, like what you might see in the States. And so around that singularization, we're constantly in a space where we're responding to police brutality. What would it look like to take a visionary approach to change around that? So while we have people agitating for change in relationship to its response to the police, are we also looking at what transformative praxis and community accountability could look like? What would non-police and non-prison-based strategies on dealing with violence in our communities look like? When something happens, oftentimes the first place that we go, regardless of what our particular politic is, if it's something that's violent or dangerous, we call the police. It's something that we've been ingrained to do. It's something we've been instilled to do. We don't necessarily have the infrastructure to respond to sort of devastation in our communities, or tragedy in our communities, or violence in our communities. And so what ends up happening is we call the cops. What we're really deeply invested in, and what I think could be very useful tips and points, is to develop community accountability and consent-based structures that look at non-prison and non-police-based strategies. So it's looking at holding a person accountable for their violent behavior by having values and practices to hold everyone, to uphold everyone to. But also looking at, so let's say I've done something harmful in the community. As opposed to calling the police, remind me of those values and practices that I have to uphold. Hold me accountable, but also look at the socioeconomic and political conditions that inform my behavior. Have an agreement between the community that you're not going to call the police in the event that something happens. And that means you have to develop the infrastructure too. So you need a critical response team that could be sort of rotational in the community, that's going to be determined by the community, that's going to be people from the community, that is self-determined by the community. And that, I've seen it happen time and time again, and it really, what it does is it destabilizes the sort of presence that police have in our communities and really names them for what they are, which is an incredible threat to us. We actually don't need police. That's the reality. And as long as we continue to participate in that culture where they're meant to be here to serve and protect, when we develop our own autonomous communities and responses to violence, we automatically challenge that narrative of truth around police being here to serve and protect. They are relatively new in the major scheme of things. We don't actually need them. I know many apartment building complexes, for example, that have an agreement that, if something goes down, we're not going to call the cops. We're going to deal with it as a community. We're going to bring that person or that situation in and hold it close and have a critical response team that can navigate that. I think that's an incredibly useful tool while we're looking at actively demilitarizing the police to really challenge that truth and that narrative that we actually need them. While the police are, sort of the teeth of the government, we need to know that the government is deeply invested in protecting them, but once we really start to disrupt and challenge that truth around what they're supposed to be to us and what they're supposed to represent to us, then we can change the culture of what policing looks like as well. While we simultaneously agitate and escalate and disrupt on the ground, I think it's incredibly important that we do that. Social media is obviously a useful tool that has been employed again and again since its advent. As a useful tip, we always record. But to find ways to do it that also keep you safe. And to know that every time that we're recording, we're also challenging that narrative. I mean, would we have known that young teenage black girl in Spring Valley in the States, when we saw her get ripped from her desk and thrown onto the ground by that police officer and dragged out of the classroom? Would we have known had a student not been recording it? And word is that the reason why that happened was because she had a cell phone in her hand and wouldn't put it away. Here's the startling truth. That police officer who did that had been doing that for years. And it was in that moment that we saw it because of the movement that we exist in and the time that we exist in. And so to utilize it while we're developing tools and strategies and while we're agitating on the ground, to look at what tools that we have now and what's been useful. I think particularly here in the UK, the police that you have here, the standard police on the ground, are not armed, and yet people are still dying. In North America, they'll say that the issue is around police having guns. But I think what the UK does is really demonstrate that that's not actually the problem. The problem is, in so many ways, anti-black racism. The problem is colonialism and its imperialist structure and how it devalues black lives and dehumanizes racialized people as a whole. And so the more that we do to challenge the narrative and the culture around what the police are, who they are, and what they actually represent, that should be a focus as much as agitation and having a very specific campaign should be. And the implementation of non-police-based or prison-based strategies and transformative strategies that look at how to deal with and engage with violence in our communities. And I think critical response teams are essential in that.
So we've had over 1,518 deaths in England and Wales following police contact. What tips do you have for those of us organising against police violence and police unaccountability, as well as the cheapening of Black lives generally?
Black Lives Matter is an intervention it's a vision of, I think, femme and female-identified Black radicalism. I think it's a vision of liberation. And so what does it mean to shift beyond a reactionary place and move to a visionary one? I think it is challenging police brutality and advocating and agitating for the demilitarization of the police, while it's also talking about what Black liberation could look like. And I think the leadership is incredibly important in that, when we can look at Black queer women and Black trans people and say, oh, yes, you're equipped and you have the tools. When we're thinking about people who are on the margins and who are most qualified to lead, that's where we need to go. If we're talking about non-prison and police-based strategies, for example, on how to deal with violence in our communities, who knows that better than migrant people and sex workers, and particularly who are Black? And let's say we're talking about Black trans women who are sex workers. When a client acts up, they can't call the police. And so they have entire infrastructures amongst themselves and their bodies on dealing with how violence happens and how to keep each other safe. Who better to lead than those people who have been existing on the margins without police, who have been dealing with abandonment and violence from every community imaginable? And so I think when the sort of ideology behind Black Lives Matter is to take those folks, build up the capacity, and put them in leadership positions, because these are the folks who have been continuously marginalized historically in our movements. I think about Black autonomy, Black self-determination, Black actualization. I think Black Lives Matter has become a platform for people all over the world to use for different movements around solidarity. And when I think about the implications of a movement like Black Lives Matter, I think it's exciting. It's creative, it's challenging, and it's exploratory. I think it looks at what anti-Black racism looks like all over the world and what the globalized impacts of anti-Black racism have done around things like mass incarceration. So I see it as a movement. I see it as a way in which to mobilize and organize. I see it as something that's going to grow into many, many different things as time goes on. And the ways in which it's been used as a platform, I think it's useful for all oppressed people from many different walks of life. Because more than anything, Black Lives Matter is a belief system. And this is incredibly important because while we agitate against particular governments and agitate against the state and institutions, what we're dealing with at the heart of it is a belief system. The imperialist, white supremacist, capitalist, heteropatriarchy that we live in is a belief system. So if you were to get rid of your government now, if Canada was to get rid of its government now, and they were just wiped out, we would still have the same types of infrastructure in place and colonialist ideals because it's a belief system. And what better to counteract a belief system with a belief system? So Black Lives Matter is a vision of radical change that centralizes the most marginalized among us, and putting them in positions of leadership to self-determine and sort of set a precedent and a narrative in our communities. But it's a belief system. When you say Black Lives Matter, it inherently restores and challenges, it restores the humanization of Blackness, but it challenges the current narratives that exist. The fulcrum of white supremacy is Black liberation, and I think Black Lives Matter really looks at that in an integral and necessary and important way.
Of course, Black Lives Matter movement is about much more than just police brutality. If I was to list them, the list would almost be endless. Could you perhaps list a couple of these for us, though?
How to keep it intersectional? I think there's a lot of ways. I think being less grounded in an identity and more grounded in a politic. And if your politic centralizes those who are most marginalized, then that'll come out in your practice. And so I, for example, embody a Black trans feminist politic. And what that means is I center Black liberation, but at the heart of it, when it also says Black trans feminist, it's looking at the experiences of trans, female, femme, non-binary identified people. And it's very specific for that reason, but I can take that sort of analysis and that politic and apply it to many different situations. So if I'm looking at Palestine, for example, I can still have a Black trans feminist politic and apply it to the situation of occupation and Zionism that's happening in Palestine. And it's not, so we need to start looking at sort of Black liberation not as something that derails, but as something that expands people's movements. Climate change, for example, is a movement that has everything to do with Blackness and Black lives. It's people of color all over the world who are going to be most directly impacted by climate change and by global change, and already have. We've seen it in Haiti. We saw it in Hurricane Katrina. We saw it in the Philippines. It's people of color all over the world who are going to be impacted by that. So if we take that politic of Black liberation and Black radicalism and start at the very bottom and apply it to different movements that we have, that is intersectional. But I think what often happens is the singularization of the Black identity is a thing that polarizes our movements and that inhibits our ability to have intersectional approaches. Because the reality is, for those who refuse or cannot say Black Lives Matter, that is actually anti-Black racism. The refusal or inability to say Black Lives Matter, or the co-opting it into other things, like All Lives Matter, is just political immaturity. And I think a fear of Black people and Black liberation. So with that in mind, here are my tips. Once a politic, a set of values and practices are established by a particular team, like Black trans feminism, for example, you take that and you look at who's going to build with you. We don't need critical mass. We don't need thousands and thousands of people on the streets. That happens eventually. What you need is critical connections. So critical connections, I think, is an incredible way to sort of build a particular team around you who can do that work and disseminate tasks. I think, and challenging the culture that we currently exist in and the type of truth that we have now. I think truth is something that's sort of taken for granted in a lot of ways. Looking at what questions that we're asking of each other, developing a sort of set of values and practices that we all ascribe to. I think things like that are something that can be really useful. But the reality is, in the UK, the best people who actually know how to organize and mobilize around issues that come up here are people from the UK. Stateside strategies are not going to translate here. They don't translate in Canada. And so to recognize that sometimes something that worked in the past isn't going to work now. And it's not about abandoning it. It's about changing the questions that we're asking. I think we get locked into a particular narrative of what liberation and Black liberation is supposed to look like. And we need to shift the narrative on that.